spent a lunch hour with the mayor of Beit Sahor, who talked movingly about how families that have resided in the Holy Land, the land of the Holy One, for centuries, are now giving up their places because of how difficult things have been made by actions of the Israeli government. And so
that's what it sounded like on July 1st when the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in Calgary, the Most Reverend Gregory Kerr-Wilson, stood at the microphone of his church's assembly and explained why members should pass his resolution on justice and peace in Palestine and Israel. The Archbishop urged the church to take out one paragraph, though. It compared Israel's treatment of Palestinians with how white settler colonials in Canada treated the First Nations. And that section had raised the hackles of Jewish groups in Canada. And as you heard on Monday's show, an Alberta rabbi, Gila Kane, explained to the gathering exactly why the clause was, in her words, offensive. But the rest was passed unchanged, even though the Archbishop admits some of it probably could have been worded better, and they should have done more talking to Jewish groups ahead of time. But his convictions haven't changed about what the church's priorities should be in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it all stems from what he personally saw and heard during his only fact-finding trip to Israel and the territories nearly 20 years ago in 2004.
I think it is an issue that we cannot turn away from.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, July the 18th, 2023. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, sponsored by Metropia. Archbishop Gregory Kerr-Wilson has been an Anglican priest for over 30 years. He started out in Toronto at St. Paul's on Bloor, with stops in Brampton, Edmonton, Qu'Appelle, and now Calgary. A few years ago, when the church's 1 million followers in Canada were about to elect a new leader, he was one of the top 5 contenders for the post, although he didn't win. Fast forward to this year's General Assembly meeting. As you heard yesterday in our interview with Rabbi Gila Kane, Jewish leaders were pleased that the Anglicans voted to take out a prayer from their official hymn book, which called for converting Jews, and to replace it with one calling for reconciliation. While Archbishop Kerr-Wilson didn't directly stick-handle that motion, he joins me now to share the background to it and to his own motion on Israel-Palestine. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
So we're right in about a week after the city was seized by other matters besides horses, and that, of course, was the synod of your church in Canada. And I guess you guys were the hosts, the host city.
Yes, we were.
So I want to just go to quickly talk about the leftover prayer that was still kind of in there regarding conversion of Jews and feeling sorry that we didn't accept Jesus as our Savior. Can you just briefly talk about why that was still in there, and was it even being used at all?
What I would say is that, first of all, it was in what was called our Book of Common Prayer, which is the official prayer book of the Anglican Church of Canada. Many churches don't have a lot of access to, or no, they don't use it a lot because there's also a newer book, an alternative book. So a lot of places don't use it on all that regular basis. But even in many places where it is, that particular prayer, in fact, I don't remember ever being in a service where it was read in my whole life, not even once. And there was 2 prayers, actually. One was officially removed years ago, and somehow this second one just under the radar or something. Nobody noticed it, and so suddenly somebody came along and said, well, wait a second, we still have this prayer in our prayer book, and it needs to be fixed. In fact, it was our Prayer Book Society, I believe, who are the traditionalists who like to keep the prayer book as much as possible, and they were the one, or they were at least part of the effort that came along and said, this needs to be changed. And just to say that our prayer book, because it is the official one, it takes a lot more time to change it. So you have to, prepare everybody, make the motion, it has to be passed, and then 3 years later it has to come back to another synod to be passed a second time in order for it. So they had done that with the previous prayer. With this one, we did 2019 as the first go, and then this was the final one to have it removed. So
yeah, but the point about that is, even if it was rarely used, as you're saying, it still caused friction and hurt to Jewish people. And I know I'd like you to speak a little bit about what you hope, and what the church hopes getting rid of it and replacing it with something better will do towards the relationship?
Well, I mean, clearly, there's a deep desire on the part of Anglicans to be in right relationship with our Jewish brothers and sisters, and to recognize that we have an inheritance. An inheritance. I don't even want to call it that. We have a history. We'll call it a history where that has not been good, where there has been anti-Semitism in the past, where there's been all sorts of things that have been done and said. And I think this is part of an ongoing trajectory of saying that all has to be fixed. And we have to go back and we have to change things. We have to put things right. We have to reestablish better relationships.
Have you personally ever been to Israel?
I have, yes. And I wish I could go back because it was only 9 days, and 9 days is short.
When was that?
2004. I was the dean of a cathedral in Edmonton at the time, and we had a conference, and normally it was in North America, but everybody went to Israel for that one. And so we stayed at St. George's College in Jerusalem, and then toured around and saw, well, of course, it was a little bit stereotypically, we went to Bethlehem and Nazareth, and and then of lots of time, of course, in Jerusalem as well, at the site of the temple site, the museum that was there was very profound. And I have to say, it was profound and touching. As somebody who has been reading the Hebrew Scriptures for so long, all my life, and has been praying the Psalms all my life, to come across something, the phrases that I'm so used to saying, I lift up my eyes to the hill, from where does my help come? And as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so does the Lord surround his people. It's one thing to say it when you're sitting in Canada praying the prayer. It's a different thing to stand on Mount of Olives and look down at Jerusalem surrounded by the mountains and say, these Psalms are just, the geography and the prayers are just, sorry, a little moment here. It's just beautiful. It was beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
How did your journey to Israel help you understand what the objection was about Israel-Palestine? So now can you understand that, and why? How did you hear them when they said this? When Rabbi Kane said this, how did that understanding come to you?
Yeah, I have to say I was really moved by Rabbi Kane's talk. I really was. And I speak for a living in a lot of ways, but it's hard to put words on it because it was just so moving, and how she talked about it. It was just, a deep and profound awareness again of the connection of Jewish people with the land, whether they're living in Israel and identify as Israelis or not.
So is that why it's not a deal breaker to pull that clause out about how it's not the same as indigenous reconciliation for Jewish people as it is that the Palestinians are not in the same equivalency?
I think for some people it was. For many people it was. I think it was very. People were very touched by the Rabbi's comments. For myself, the comment that was made that not every that's the lens in Canada, and that lens isn't apply everywhere around the world. And good to be made aware of our own local bias. That this is what we've been through, and we've spent a lot of time in the Anglican Church of Canada on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So we can see how that concern would be raised, but recognizing that it's a different story. For me, the bigger thing. The moving part was important, but the other, for me personally, the thing was to sort of have that rethink and say, yeah, actually, that's problematic in all sorts of ways, historically, and all sorts of ways.
But the whole actual resolution which you sponsored is raising some eyebrows and making people upset about the fact that it was pushed through, even though there were some requests to kind of wait another couple of years and do more homework. Why did you specifically put this forward yourself?
Well, the urgency, and I wouldn't be able to say necessarily that I felt a real profound urgency, except that part of the trip to Israel was that we also connected with our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are Christians, and we also had some experience of their daily life. And talk to people that were living under those circumstances. And what we became aware of, and I'm just telling my personal experience now about for me, was that, and I want to put it this way because I think it's really important to put it this way, and I kind of wish we had changed in one of the other paragraphs farther down in the explanation. It said, recognizing that Israeli discrimination, and I think it would have been greatly preferable to say the government of Israel's discrimination, because for me that's a huge distinction, that there's many Israelis who disagree with Israeli government policy, and that is actually part of what has fueled how this all came about, was also conversations with, and I'm just trying to remember the name of the organization, B'Tselem, did I say that right? B'Tselem, the human rights group in Jerusalem, and recognizing that, just like in Canada, we criticize the government all the time because there are things that the government does, not only that we disagree with, but it does things that are just flat out wrong. And this is, I think, needs to be focused in that way. It's about current government of Israel policy in relation to West Bank and to some of the situation for Palestinians. As you'll note that, of course, we went. There was great care taken to make sure that we were also stating that we recognized, Israel's legitimate rights for security and that sort of thing. But there's a place where, certainly what I saw in 2004 and what others have seen since, is that there are places where current government of Israel policy, it's pretty hard to call it about security. It starts to cross some boundaries, and I think the reason for the urgency for many was, well, it's been going on. Something needs to be said, and we need to, And of course, the action plan is to encourage the government of Canada to sort of take that on.
Which they are. They're going to be doing hearings at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they just gave $100 million to UNRWA. So
right, yeah. So the urgency in that sense was really about the fact that this has continued to go on, and the longer that it goes on, the more and more folks in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem whose lives are seriously negatively affected, and in many ways. Now, point was made by some of our folks that, we should have had more conversation in the lead up, and I would concur with that. We most certainly should have done that. But when it was sort of weighed as, well, we didn't do a good job on that. Do we just simply put it on hold and then go back and do that, or do we do this and then continue with the conversation? And that's kind of where it fell out for people, was to say, well, we need to do that, and because there are, the issues for people in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, they're now, and so, yeah.
When it was passed, I guess some people might have kind of looked at it and said, well, they're nice about praying for the Jews, but then they have this resolution about the Jewish homeland, which is much more strong against the government and doesn't give any mention about the Palestinian terrorism and what their responsibility is. People are like, well, how do we figure this? What is going on the one hand, but on the other hand? So help me here, explain this to our listeners.
Well, okay, and I would say, at least the way that I thought about it was, frankly, I've not heard anybody attempt to justify Palestinian terrorism at all. And I was just reading it last night again, and I thought, yeah, I can see the comment about, saying that sadly compounded by grave divisions and inadequacies of the Palestinian authorities, including reprisals against opposition leaders, etc., a lack of legal and democratic accountability. That in itself is also could have been strengthened by simply outright making a condemnation. But again, there's not anybody that I've bumped into in our church that would say, oh no, the terrorist attacks are justified, or that they ought to continue. I mean, and that could have been. Yeah, it's quite possible we should have included something about that.
What dangers are you seeing now for Christians in Israel, in the West Bank?
Well, I think the thing that we're seeing that's worrying is the ongoing, loss of place to live for families that have been there for centuries and centuries and centuries. And again, my direct experience is 2004, so I apologize. I haven't been back since 2004. It's 19 years. But, when we were there, we had conversations with Palestinian folk who, again, were not anti-Jewish in any way, but what they would say is, our families have been here for all these centuries, and now life has been made so miserable for our young people that they leave because they can't see a future. They see no future for themselves. And those who can't leave often become radicalized because they have no way out, and they see no future, they see no hope. And that, again, leads to, it's a vicious cycle of response. And I think, I know that many of our, I was going to say Anglicans and Lutherans, it was a joint thing. Many of the Palestinian Christians are very keen to be working at how do we build peace? How do we bring this into, bring some sense of coexistence that is more than just being in the same place, but it is, has justice about it and real peace. But when people in their lives that they're being, crushed, then that and in some ways they are. I mean, we hear the stories of people being evicted from their homes and land being taken, and in the West Bank, and that just keeps exacerbating the situation. And I would say basic fundamental human rights of some Palestinians, many Palestinians, are being frankly violated by this particular government's approach. And I think some of us would say that it looks pretty obvious that, again, this current government's policy is to try to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible, full stop. And, get rid of them one way or the other, make them move out, whatever it is.
Well, it doesn't help when some of the ministers in the current government say things actually like that in public, in Paris and whatever, which we know, we've talked about and reported. So, I mean, there'll be a lot of Jewish people who agree with you from Canada, who are progressive and left-wing. Finally, I want to just double down on one thing. It's about clause where they talk about Christian Zionism. I understood that you want to remove Christian Zionism and the influence of Christian Zionism from the Anglican Church. And what is Christian Zionism, and why would that be not welcome in your church?
Yeah, the definition that was given in the thing was to say that specifically we're talking about, not only people who, part of it says those who encourage the return of Jews to Israel. I thought that was a little odd way to frame it up, because obviously if Jewish people want to move to Israel, why not? It's the homeland, right? And that connection that we've talked about earlier. But I think this particular piece that to do with Christian Zionism really is connected to a kind of religious view that connects to apocalyptic imagery that once Israel is fully established. And I think sometimes when I've had conversations with people, what they mean by that is that the Palestinian presence is removed. I've actually had fellow Christians say that to me. Once the Palestinian element is removed and Muslims are gotten out of the holy city, and then the temple is rebuilt, then Jesus will come back. And I have to say that although I have heard that, it's very, in my experience, very rare in our churches. But to the extent that there are some that still hold those kinds of views, I think what the word that we used to do was to decrease its impact, its presence and impact, and to commitment to challenge it as a viewpoint. So the idea is to sort of say, that's not where we stand as a church. We don't have a belief that somehow reinstating this is going to bring the second coming of Jesus. It's not, and that it's not helpful, because it doesn't actually help. In my view, it doesn't help the state of Israel either establish a kind of peace and justice that needs to be, and that many Israelis are looking for, to have Christians fomenting that kind of attitude in the background. So, yeah.
So now I understand it. Because, Israel likes Christian Zionists, and they're the biggest tourists too, right?
Yes, I get that. And I have to say, it would be nice. It would be good for more, for lack of a better word, mainline Christians to go and make a visit and say, actually, this isn't about Christian Zionism in that sense. This is about the modern state of Israel. And I would always want to encourage people to look at some of the beautiful passages out of the Hebrew Scriptures that talk about Jerusalem, the place where all the nations come because they come to worship the Lord. It's not an exclusive kind of a thing. It's a vision that says that through Abraham's descendants, will all the nations of the world be blessed. And that's a different thing than saying we must crush everybody else who's not who doesn't belong there by our lights.
Well, this has been very, very helpful. You've explained it well to me, I think. Is there anything you want our listeners to understand that I didn't ask?
No, you're very thorough. And maybe I'll just reiterate again that this motion was really about a very particular concern about the current government of Israel's policies related to Palestinians. And I think I could confidently say that for our folks, we would see it as being a statement of support for Jews and for Israelis broadly, in the sense that it's calling for true peace and justice in Israel.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia, integrity, community, quality, and customer care. Today's listener shout-out goes to Hernan Popper of Winnipeg. He'll be remembering the 29th anniversary today, July 18th, of the bombing of the Jewish Community Headquarters building in his native Buenos Aires, Argentina, in 1984. 85 people were killed, 300 more were hurt. The attack had been blamed on Iran, but no one's been brought to justice yet in all these years. In Winnipeg tonight, the Jewish community will hold its annual memorial for the Amia bombings. It'll be at the Asper JCC starting at 6:30 p.m. And you can hear my interview with Hernan Popper on the CJN Daily. We did it a couple of years ago and put a link to that episode in our show notes. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.